home. And I turn this over to you now, John.
Thanks, Lori. Um, Good afternoon, everybody. It's always nice to have the last session when we've been sitting at a computer all day. So bear with me one more time, okay? And so today, I want to thank everybody who's presented so far also. And Jeff Parker, thank you for answering all my questions as I prepared for this and getting ready to go. I am not a technical guy by any means, and he saved me multiple times this week. So so as I do this, what we're gonna do is I'm gonna outline a little bit. I got it broken up into two sections. The first section we're gonna talk about. We're gonna use Jemar Tisby's "The Color of Compromise" book for a resource to talk about our responses and how do we respond. I've been tasked with talking about how do we engage from a local church perspective, and so Dr. Crowder asked some wonderful questions there. Where do we go from here? How do we become an ally? Part of what I'm going to focus on for us is how do we. I serve a local rural church in just south of Springfield, Illinois. We don't live and in that urban environment. So how do we, as the First Christian Church in Virden, help and engage in this process? And one of the ways that I've been working on for the last couple of years is actually learning and teaching post-colonial theology, and learning and teaching people our church how to look differently or through a different theological lens than we've looked at before, because what we've done for so long is we've looked through a colonial lens, and that colonial lens has allowed us to remain complicit to the racist agenda, and that's in the churches. That's not just in the world, that's in the churches. The churches have succumbed to that history just as much as anybody else has. And so what I think is important is what we'll do in the second part of this is I'm going to take you through a little bit of a discussion on what post-colonial theology is and how we can engage in our churches in that way to help us hear voices that have not been heard, as well as take on systems that have not been taken on, and because that's what we're getting at. So the scripture text that Lori put out for me to use on this was Ephesians 4, 1-6. And I want you to hear it before we start and go through this, because I want you to listen to what it says, because it's talking about one body. We are one body of Christ, one body of Christ. And I think that's essential for us to get to that place where we develop an ability to be one body of Christ and to see the value in everybody. So as a prisoner of the Lord, I beg you to live in a way that is worthy of the people God has chosen to be his own. Always be humble and gentle, patiently put up with each other and love each other. Try your best to let God's Spirit keep your hearts united. Do this by living at peace. All of you are part of the same body. There is only one Spirit of God, just as you were given one hope when you were chosen to be God's people. We have only one Lord, one faith, and one baptism. There is one God who is the Father of all people. Not only is God above all others, but God works by using all of us, and God lives in all of us. God lives in all of us. And the challenge for us is that too often we've separated and segregated, and we've allowed that to remain positive or remain as a constant. So as we go through this, I'm going to ask you guys to dialogue and to be part of this with me, because we have to work together to get to that place where we will learn how to engage. So I want you to I'm going to put a video on right now of Jemar Tisby talking about the fierce urgency of now, which is a quote from Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech. Because it's about a 20-minute video, so it's a longer video, but I want you to hear his words because I think they resonate with, and then we're going to discuss it when we come back. So I'm going to try to put this on for you now. Can you hear that, guys?
Burdened by the brutality of racism in America, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to the microphone near the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and he delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. Now, many of us remember that line about being judged not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. But before that, toward the beginning, he uses a phrase that I just love: the fierce urgency of now. To quote Dr. King, he says, "We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off," he said, "or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to rise from the dark, desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice." That was 1963. We've seen so much progress since then. We've seen a Black president elected. We've seen the blockbuster film Black Panther. We've seen Black people make entrances into professions and neighborhoods that they never had access to before. But for all that progress, we could still say that we must respond to the fierce urgency of now. Throughout this survey of US history, racism, and the church, we can see that although we've come a long way, we still have a long way to go. So this segment serves to present some practical ways to address the current state of racial injustice in America. Those who have humbly submitted to the tutelage of history can't help but exclaim, "I have to do something." Here's how to do it. So whenever I give talks on racial justice, whether at a church or a conference or some other event, there's usually a Q&A at the end. And the most frequent question I ever get is, what do I do? This is from the people who understand that racism is a problem, not only in the past, but still to the present day. And they want to be part of the solution. They want to know how to fight racism. Well, over time, I used to just give sort of this scattering of answers, try this, do that, here's a suggestion. I finally developed a framework that I hope is helpful, and it's called the ARC of Racial Justice. ARC is an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. Let me break it down. So first of all, awareness. You have to know how race operates in order to be an effective anti-racist activist. In other words, you have to study the history. So doing things like following this video series is one way you can build awareness. But in general, as people in this nation, we have to do more when it comes to figuring out what has happened with racism, how it functions from a sociological and an individual perspective, and all the different ways that race and racism manifest themselves in our society. So, some practical suggestions for building your awareness. Watch documentaries. Or my favorite answer when people ask me a question is just 2 words long: Google it. We have so much information available on the internet. It's literally at your fingertips, but there are other things that you can do to raise your awareness as well. You can take a class, whether in person or online. If I'm talking to any college students or even any graduate students, if you haven't taken a class in history, please do so, especially US history, beyond whatever the requirement is. There are many other ways to build your awareness as well. You can read books, particularly books on US history. Go through some of the ones that I've recommended in previous segments. You can also talk to others and get their perspectives in order to increase your awareness. So knowledge is part of what it takes to fight for racial justice. But it doesn't just stop there. We can't just have these big heads full of information and not do anything. Another aspect is relationships. So when we think about Christianity, when God wanted to reconcile humankind to himself, he didn't send an email or a memo. He didn't type a tweet or post a comment on Facebook. No, God sent a person, his son, Jesus Christ. And what that tells us is that all reconciliation is incarnational. It happens through real people communicating with one another and getting to know one another. All reconciliation then is relational. So relationships are absolutely indispensable to this work of racial justice. You got to put flesh and blood on people. We can't just study this in the abstract. We have to know folks and look in their eyes when they tell us about their racial experiences, hear the sound of their voice when they talk about their perspectives on these issues, and get to know them beyond just the stereotypes and the big blanket statements that people make about other people groups. Because when you know someone, when you care about someone, then what affects them starts to affect you. Finally, and this I think is critical, is commitment to action. You see, I think a lot of people can agree that awareness is important, and a lot of people will agree that relationships are important. In fact, they'll even say, well, listen, I treat all people the same. I try not to treat anyone better or worse because of their skin color. And in fact, I have lots of relationships with people across the color line. Something I hear a lot of times from white people is some of my best friends are Black. The idea behind that, it's well-intentioned, but it's basically saying, well, since I have good individual relationships with people who are different, then I can't be part of the problem of racism. So why do I need to care about this? Well, this gets to the idea of commitment. It's the idea that racism works itself out not just through interpersonal relationships, but also through systems, structures, laws, policies, institutions. And so if we really want to commit to anti-racist action, then we have to commit to fighting the ways racism shows up in impersonal ways, not just interpersonal ways. That's this commitment. Furthermore, a commitment implies some staying power. Like, this isn't just going to go away after you watch this video or after a day, a week, or a month, but in fact, it's an entire posture. It's a way of doing life that is fundamentally oriented toward being able to spot racism wherever it shows up and then doing something about it. So the arc of racial justice has laid out a framework, a very basic framework for understanding various kinds of anti-racist actions. It's not a linear process. It's not something anyone does in order, like step 1, step 2, step 3, and it certainly doesn't end. It's a cycle that's going to continue as long as you're engaged in this work. But let's get even more practical here. So the ARC model helps us sort of conceptualize and have a framework of things. And now I want to talk about just a few ways that we can begin to address racism in the church and beyond. Now, I'll give you a heads up. These focus on more of those systemic and institutional aspects I was talking about. It's not really advice on how to build relationships across the color line. It's broader than that, gets down to affecting the systems that affect thousands of people, even the entire country. First off, let's dive right in. I think the only other R word that's more controversial among Christians than racism is the word reparations. Yeah, that one. Reparations, when people hear that, they think of just sort of writing a check to Black people as recompense for slavery. Well, I certainly wouldn't exclude that, but I would give some context to this theory and the concept of reparations. We can't talk about racial justice unless we talk about money. It's the idea that race-based chattel slavery was fundamentally an exploitative economic system. Throughout centuries of labor, enslaved Black people were not paid for their work. Not only were they not paid during their time of enslavement, this continued after the Civil War, after emancipation, and during the Jim Crow era too. For instance, they were excluded from home ownership, and your home is typically your greatest source of wealth. They were excluded from certain educational opportunities, education that could have granted them training or degrees, which could have enabled them to get jobs and positions that would have made them more secure financially. And they were prevented from taking certain jobs. We talked about in the military how Black soldiers were relegated to menial roles. They couldn't achieve many command positions and the salaries that might go with that. This happened even in the civilian realm as well, where Black people were not promoted or were excluded from certain jobs that would have enhanced their family's wealth and lead to economic advancement. And because of factors like this, generational poverty going all the way back to the antebellum era persists to this day. The wealth gap between Black and white Americans serves as an example. For every dollar in a white household, Black households have about 7 cents. Black people comprise 13% of the US population, but hold only 3% of the nation's wealth. So what do we do about this as a nation? More specifically, what do we do about this as a church? There's a Presbyterian pastor named Duke Kwon, and he talks about this concept of ecclesiastical reparations. I like this idea of ecclesiastical reparations because I think many Christians have the idea that we have to wait on politics or government to sort of pass a law or make a policy around reparations. And the reality is, we as the church can do something about the economic exploitation of Black people and trying to remedy the present problems that have come from this historic injustice. And there's precedence for this too. Pastor Kwon references the Old Testament and a prayer that Daniel prayed. Daniel prayed for himself and also for the people who came before him. He says he prayed for our princes and our ancestors who were covered with shame in Daniel 9:8. What that means is that even though you have not owned a slave, even though I, in my lifetime, have never been a slave in the sense of race-based chattel slavery, that we are still responsible for what people did who came before us. And we are still responsible for the ongoing repercussions and impacts of those past actions. So within Christianity, there's a sense of corporate and communal responsibility. You could apply the same idea to the idea of reparations. We simply cannot be serious about anti-racism unless we talk about that topic they tell you not to talk about, which is money, and the fact that race-based chattel slavery and its ongoing legacy has affected the financial situation of African descendants of slaves in America. So reparations, at least a conversation about it, is one practical step that we can take to bring about racial justice. Here's another one: take down Confederate monuments. I go to school in the state of Mississippi, at the University of Mississippi. At the entrance of campus, as I record this, there stands a Confederate statue. It stood there for decades. It serves as a rallying point for neo-Confederates and white supremacists. They gather around it as their rallying point. There are all kinds of monuments and signs and symbols to the Confederacy. Again, in Mississippi, it is the last state in the Union that has the Confederate emblem in the canton of its state flag. Every time I pass that flag, it's a sign to me as a Black American that I don't belong there. Or if I do belong there, it's in a second-class status position. I think we need new symbols and new monuments that celebrate the unity of all Americans across racial and ethnic lines. So what would it look like instead of a Confederate monument? We had monuments to people like Ida B. Wells, who used investigative reporting to bring to light the reality of lynching and hope to confront it. What if we had monuments to people like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was born a poor sharecropper in Mississippi in 1917, and in her 40s became a civil rights activist, lost everything she had in pursuit of justice for people in America? I think we need to have a greater imagination of what our civic spaces could look like and who gets represented there. Here's another suggestion on a practical level. How about we start a new seminary? No shade to existing seminaries, but here's the reality. If an institution was started without an intentional focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's going to be very hard for that institution to add those things in later. I heard a pastor one time give the analogy of baking a cake. And he said, what if you were baking a cake and you had the bowl and you had the flour and you had the eggs and you had the baking soda, whatever goes into a cake, and you made it, you mixed up the batter, you put it in the oven, and you take it out and you taste it, and you realize you forgot to put in the sugar. Now what do? You just pick up a handful of sugar and sprinkle it on top? It's not going to be the same. So many of our institutions are functioning that way when it comes to race and diversity. They forgot to bake it in to the very foundations of the institution, and now they're trying to sprinkle some diversity on the top in order to fix the problem. But it just won't work. So perhaps we need new institutions, for instance, a new seminary. In this new seminary, you could, number one, assemble a diverse teaching staff of men and women from across the racial and ethnic spectrum. You could also plan a curriculum that was intentionally diverse so that most of your curriculum isn't just reading dead white guys. As helpful as they can be, there's a lot more people who have weighed in on theology from a Christian perspective. You can set up the systems of the seminary to accommodate people who may come from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And so night classes and weekend classes, and not just a traditional setup where many people who are working can't make it. You can set up scholarships that would help racial and ethnic minorities as a form of reparations, but then you bring them into a seminary that has them in mind from the start. They're represented in the faculty and staff, and even all the way up to the trustees level. So let's imagine what that might look like to have a seminary faithful to the scriptures, but also faithful to the part of the scriptures that talks about God's beautiful vision for heavenly diversity. Here's one of my favorites. Make Juneteenth a national holiday. Juneteenth is a mashup of the words June and 19th. It represents the day when enslaved people in Texas first learned of their emancipation, and to this day, it stands as the oldest celebration of Black freedom in America. I think we should make Juneteenth a national holiday for a couple of reasons. Number one, this is one of the most epochal events in US history. I mean, think about it. For centuries, the nation condoned race-based chattel slavery. It took the nation's bloodiest war, the Civil War, to bring about the abolition of slavery. And so this is not just an event in Black history. This is US history. What making Juneteenth would do is cause us as a nation every year to pause and think and remember, to look back at where we were, a society that once called Black people property, to say that we had to go to war to end it, and to honestly celebrate the progress that we've made, that race-based chattel slavery no longer is the law of the land. That's progress, and we should celebrate it. At the same time, making Juneteenth a national holiday would also remind us of where we are and where we still need to go. It would serve as motivation for us to keep pressing and keep pushing so that our children and the Christians who come after us in this nation can say that things are better for them in the future than they were for us in the past. At the end of the day, we can make many, many more suggestions, but this much is clear. The American church has compromised with racism. Countless Christians have ignored, obscured, or misunderstood this history. The excuses are gone. This information cannot be hidden. Now that racism has been exposed, what are you going to do about it? In the Bible, James 4:17 says, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and then doesn't do it, it is sin for them. The church today must practice the good that ought to be done when it comes to racial justice. To look at this history and then refuse to act only perpetuates racist patterns. It's time for the church to stand against racism and to compromise no longer.
Okay, there's a lot packed into that. But I love what he talks about there, that we can no longer be complicit to this, right? We can no longer follow this concept. And I want to share with you a story that I read about September 15th, 1963, which is the day that the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed and 4 little girls lost their life. The girls prepared for Youth Day as so excited. Their parents would be waiting for them, listening to them sing songs, recite poems. What an encouraging time it would be. But the blast, which killed all 4 girls and injured at least 20 others, left the whole floor 5 feet wide and 2 feet deep. It decapitated Cynthia. A newspaper report said that every stained glass window was blown out of the church except for one that showed Christ leading children. The face of Christ was blown out. But before the funeral, on the day after the bombing, a lawyer named Charles Morgan Jr. met the Young Men's Business Club in Birmingham, Alabama. And of course, that Young Man's Business Club was all white. And he changed his speech that day. Reflecting on the events, he asked the question, who did it? Who threw that bomb? The answer should be, we all did it. Every last one of us is condemned for the crime and the bombing before it and for a decade ago. We all did it. So when I read that, we all did it. And that's where we're at right now with the church, is that we've all been part of this. And Dr. Tisby talks about the ARC, the awareness, relationship, and commitment. And I wanted to ask you, as far as he talks about awareness, how do we become more aware in our life today? How do we become more aware within our local churches of the issue of racism? Do we have it in us to teach this and work through it? He put out some great suggestions, documentaries, watch documentaries, read books. There is so much literature right now out there. There's so much out there that we can get involved in and see and to understand and educate ourselves. But the other piece of the puzzle, the really important piece to me was relationships. And relationships are extremely important for us to grasp and to work through and to see as connections for this. As we've done today, and as Pastor Ed Morris was talking during Dr. Crowder's presentation, I thought how wonderful it has been this during the COVID to connect with Ed. I hope you don't mind me sharing this. Ed got me involved with Howard Thurman during the COVID, and it was such a blessed gift to connect that way. It's been such a great gift to get up every morning and read Dr. Crowder's prayer each morning. I mean, these are relationships that are being built, but we have to do so more and more. We have to be willing to work towards these relationships, because that is what will change the church, is when we truly dig into the concept of gathering together and seeing each other as whole and as human beings. The question was asked earlier in the day about why we don't see it. And part of the challenge, I think, in the local churches is that we oftentimes feel, especially in the rural churches, we oftentimes feel that we're not heard often, and so what happens when you're not heard, then you get angry, or you get scared, and you're scared of losing power or losing status. And that is what's happening right now, at least in the rural churches around here. So when instead of seeking to see the multiple layers and working towards the greater kingdom of God, we want to hold on to our status and our notion of who we are as church. And in doing so, we do not see the people we hurt or the people we harm. I hope that makes sense. It's the challenge for us, right, to get past that point, because we're not in true relationship with each other. The body of Christ is not a splintered body. It is because we make it a splintered body because of humanity. But Christ does not envision the body to be splintered. Christ envisions it to be whole. And we have to be strong and courageous enough to walk into this relationships, willing to stand for the creation that God has blessed us to be part of, which means we've got to let go of these dualistic mindsets too. You know, and that dualistic mindset that we like to hold on to is it's this way or no way. I think it was Melissa that brought it up earlier, the voting on the abortion issue. If you're not Christian, if you vote Democrat because there's pro-life candidates, right? All of that language, all of that dualistic language feeds into an ability to trump one of us against another, to pit each other on one side of the fence or the other. The black and white relational model as a whole is that dualistic stereotype and scapegoating model that is not Christ-like at all. I always joke with my congregation that did you ever notice that when Jesus was asked a question, he never said, you know, he's a jerk, or you know, he's just off the wall and I'm right. He said things like, let me tell you a story about a guy walking down a road and tell me, what do you think? And who do you think was the neighbor, right? He challenged us to be in relationship with each other and by thinking and truly working with each other. So when Dr. Tisby talks about the ark, that awareness, relationship, and commitment is challenging us as church to be aware of everything that surrounds us, to be aware of our brothers and sisters in Christ, to be aware when our brothers and sisters of Christ in Christ are hurting, and to be aware enough to stand in and against that pain, to help end and to heal, to be part of the healing process. And we have to do so by hearing each other's voices and listening to each other as best we possibly can. The great historian John Hope Franklin wrote this. He said, I think when knowing one's history leads one to act in a more enlightened fashion, I cannot imagine knowing one's history would not urge one to become an activist. In other words, if we are truly willing to know and to see the real history, we must be willing to do something. And for too long, the church has not been willing to do something. Just this week, Beth Roop and I were having a conversation and discussing our founding fathers. And I'm a history guy. I love our history, right, Cece? I absolutely love our church history.
Absolutely.
And I'm having to wrestle with the manner in which our founding fathers dealt with slavery. Because folks, I love the disciples of Christ. I love the history, but we got issues because Alexander Campbell was more than willing to kind of let slavery slide in order to maintain a status and a place at the table, per se, for a denomination. And so these kind of things, this part of our history, we can't ignore. We have to be willing to walk into and to see and to work towards transforming it and changing what could continue to what can be. And so how do we do that? Well, we do that by beginning to look at theology differently, to look through a different lens, to see things in a manner that truly does and will transform us. That means we have to be willing to ask different questions. You know, when you look at the text for too long, we've looked at the text the way the colonial powers look at the text, and the way the colonial powers look at the text is the way that maintains a superior or a supremacy over another. And the challenge for us is to begin to look at the text in a manner that sees us as a whole, which means asking new questions, which means doing it differently. And so now I'm gonna share my screen again with you guys. Okay, so
Yes.
Okay, so Ubuntu theology, Lori brought this up, so you're getting a double dose of it. Ubuntu theology is what led me into looking at post-colonial theology as a whole. And this is a quote from Desmond Tutu's "God is not a Christian," and a person is a person through other persons. We need other human beings for us to learn how to be human. For none of us comes fully formed into the world. We would not know how to talk, to walk, to think, or to eat as a human being unless we learned how to do these things from other human beings. For us, the solitary human being is a contradiction in terms. Now, how many people have heard that self-made man concept? That's a pretty normal concept, or one you hear a lot, or pull yourself up by your own bootstraps concept. But the reality is, and I love that Tutu points this out, is that none of us have pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps completely. We've learned things. We've read books that were written by people. People taught us how to talk. People taught us how to walk, to think, to eat. We did not get anywhere by ourselves. So that myth of individualism and pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps is just that. It's a myth. But sadly, that myth has absolutely allowed for us to maintain a sense of supremacy over other groups for far too long. And the final part of that quote is, Ubuntu is the essence of being human. It speaks of how my humanity is caught up and bound up inextricably with yours. Now I want to stop for a second there and come back to that. So when you hear that your humanity is inextricably bound up with another's, what does that make you guys feel? What does it do for you to think our humanity is bound up with each other?
That reminds me
Honestly,
of,
John, I kind of think, well, duh. And maybe that's because I'm a parent of 7 children who's shared my body.
Mhm.
I mean, it's kind of a thing where I get kind of angry in a way, because I look at this and I think only a male in power would think that they are individual by themselves. I mean, that's maybe a broad generalization, and I know that there are women who buy into that, but I think that's kind of baloney.
I agree with you, April. but when we hear this quote, can you see the different theological spectrum? Because one of the problems is when we go to this non or disconnect, then we can sell individual salvation as the only and the end all and the be all, rather than recognizing that we're called to an understanding of communal connectivity and communal salvation also, in that concept. And so it's really challenging to grasp for lots of people. But what else? What are some other things that people feel when they hear Tutu talk about the essence of humanity connected with all humanity?
Well, I was just thinking about how much it made me think of Jonah and Nineveh. And if a lot of us are honest to ourselves, we are Jonahs not wanting to go to help those people.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, we're all Nineveh. We're all sin. We're all Sin City. But how many of us really want to be that Jonah? How many are going to run the other way because they don't care. They don't want to help.
absolutely.
And I think about that essence of humanity, and that if we are all Jonah and we run, we're never going to help other people get to where they need to be.
Mm-hmm.
It takes me to our mission statement. One of our mission statements at Parkway is, we are a community, see us, love us, and it reminds me that, again, that the scripture that we just read, we are all one body under Christ. There's no individual I, there's no individual you. We are all one body under God. And by us being a community, not just community by the sense of that's our neighborhood, but a community as a body of believers that all believe in God, and we're serving God and we're serving one another. So there can't just be a you. It has to be a us together.
Yeah, and kind of a corollary in that is the journey to God is also an inner one, that if we are coming from our worst brokenness, there's no chance of seeing the best in others. We're coming from a false image of ourselves. When we can see our brokenness, understand our brokenness, and heal that brokenness within ourselves, then we also can value the humanity and the wholeness in the others. And, you know, we're rightly taught to put others before us, to deny ourselves, but there's also a gross perversion of that that says to neglect yourself, but God told us to love ourselves too. And I don't think that means to be arrogant and self-serving. I think it means there's a child of God in here that needs attention and tending to. And if you don't do that, you're going to perpetuate that hurt onto other folks. And being responsible for ourselves and our own brokenness is a place to start in healing our communities.
I think if I can tag on to that about our own brokenness and take that at a communal level, I think that Ubuntu is a challenge to us as disciples who value autonomy at sometimes the foremost and forget that we're covenantal. And it calls us back to covenant. It calls us back to that understanding of how we are in covenant with God, we are in covenant with one another, and we can't do it without that covenantal thought.
And I just want to make sure we also recognize that we have a lot of UCC folks in here who, you know, I know you're translating as you're hearing it, but that also is common between us.
I was thinking of two, speaking of one of those UCC people, I was thinking on two levels as I was listening. One, we're told if you take philosophies classes, what Desmond Tutu is teaching is common within certain communities, but it contradicts what Descartes teaches. Anytime you take, Descartes says, I am, because I think I am. So it is a starting point. A Eurocentric teaching has been a start, and I'm picking on nobody, just picking on history, okay? European teaching has always been a start of I, me, my. I laughed as April, and I love you, April. I was laughing as April was talking about being a mother of 7. God bless you. And I was thinking, and she says, well, only a man would think like that. And I laughed and I said, but see what I'm hearing two different things, because I'm a mother of none, but it takes a whole village because I've not born any children, but I have nieces and nephews and I take care of everybody else's. But there is a missing dialogue between European American women who are mothers and women of color who are mothers, because European American women also have benefited, and their children, from the injustices that have been on the backlash of other people. So there is a dialogue that even deals with white feminism and womanism. And so as we're learning and as we're growing, it's not just it's not just a European man or men in general. God is still working on them, but it is a dialogue that the whole universe groans, because in essence, we are all the descendants of a God that birthed all of us. And we keep still pointing a finger at each other instead of saying, we need to help to breathe the breath of life into each other. If that, I hope I worded that correctly.
That's great, Donna. And don't worry, because I'll pick on the European thought mindset. So you're not alone. It's because that's what part of the challenge is, that we have had so much of the colonial mindset dictated into. I mean, think about our theological educations that have come. You know, Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, right? All of these guys were propped up as great theologians. You know, I mean, and take a look at their stances on slavery and on some issues that just it's challenging for us, right? Yet how often do we hear about Sugyartha or Chennai or these different theologians from other parts of the world? Because our theological education is really colonialistic, and is dictated by that, which maintains a specific type of theology that is being played out there. So these are the challenges. So when you hear Tutu's Ubuntu, this understanding of this beautiful theological premise or understanding, and actually just a life calling to be connected to each other. That's, I think, is our first step to working towards creating the bridges that will bring down the divides and the racist ideologies that still occur, and breaking down those divisions is so essential for us. So now I'm gonna go back to sharing our screen, guys. Okay, so the theology that I think we need to follow or go into this post-colonial lens, looking through a post-colonial lens, is a theology from the underside, is what it's called, or bottom-up theology. It seeks to see the value in all humanity, and what that means is it challenges us to no longer follow that colonialistic model of the gospel is above, or the gospel is being dictated to certain people. Dr. Beth Rupp and I were having a conversation just yesterday, and she said it really well. She said the colonialistic model was one of taking the gospel to another, while the post-colonial model is a method of engaging together to better understand the gospel. And that's what it is when we start to learn or work towards this understanding of post-colonial theology, we are starting to learn about partnership rather than domination or superior motive, rather than the mission model of I'm going to come and bring it to the savages or what have you, right? That ugly mindset of I'm so much better or my theology is so much better that I've got to educate another. This is about going together with each other and communicating and being in relation with each other and learning the gospel through a partnership with each other, connecting with each other on a deeper, more profound level. And if we're going to engage in topics that are so difficult at times for many of our people, we have to do so in a way that truly develops partnerships with each other, relationships with each other. We got to do so in a way where we see the humanity in each other and work towards building those bridges and walking the walk of sharing the good news in that manner. We have to engage the text with some important questions. So the questions that the post-colonial method asks are, first of all, what is the text? Who produced it? How is its meaning determined? Meaning, think about how texts have been interpreted for so long and how oftentimes we just maintain or we remain in the status quo simply because that is exactly how it's been interpreted for X amount of years. Instead of looking at the text with a new lens or a new understanding. And that's what we're going to do here in a second, is I want to go over a text with each of you and we're going to have a discussion about that text. But who interprets it? Who has been able to interpret the text? That's an important one, because for far too often only specific people have been able or been given the authority to interpret the text. A real important text is who benefits from the interpretation. Who benefits from the interpretation of the text that you are going with or using? And what were the circumstances of the production of the text? And does the text have a message, or does the text have a different message? Those are questions that R.S. Sugiartha asks in exploring postcolonial biblical criticism. So as we come back and look at the text, one of my favorite texts is the Syrophoenician woman. Many of you guys probably love that text. So when you look at it from a postcolonial perspective, it's a challenging text. So I'm going to read the Syrophoenician text to you, and then I want us to discuss how we interpret this text and what does this text do, and how can this text, or looking at this text in a new way, help us to combat racism in our own churches or combat the concept within our church. So this is the Mark's text, and it says, Jesus left and went to Tyre, or to a region near the city of Tyre, where he stayed in someone's home. He did not want people to know he was there, but they found out anyway. A woman whose daughter had an evil spirit in her heard where Jesus was, and right away she came and knelt down at his feet. The woman was Greek and had been born in the part of Syria known as Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to force the demon out of her daughter, but Jesus said, "The children must first be fed. It isn't right to take their food and throw it to the dogs." The woman replied, "Lord, even the dogs eat the crumbs that the children drop from the table." Jesus answered, "That's true. You may go now. The demon has left your daughter." And when the woman got home, she found her child lying on the bed, and the demon had gone. So when you hear that text, what are some of the traditional ways of understanding that text that you guys have heard, or what ways have you heard that text interpreted before? Well,
I'll go ahead and say it from a cultural standpoint. You had two different cultures. You had Jesus was a Jew, and then you had a Samaritan again coming. So it was a combination of being a pure blood and then being of mixed descent. So the dialogue and what Jesus was showing in just that form of communication, that's been one way in which I have heard the sermon preached from. And how when the woman says even the dogs, she was speaking to Jesus from the view of what most Jewish people had thought of the Samaritan. So she was accepting the inferior role and trying to say, "This, yes, I'm a dog, but please help my child."
And that's a concept, a way of looking at this text. You know, there's also been the text that are the interpretation that has oftentimes been used of the woman, or Jesus was just testing the woman. It wasn't a matter that Jesus called her a dog. It was just, he was testing her. And why would we have to clean up Jesus in that text? Why do you think it's important to make Jesus he didn't call her a dog? Why is that so important for people to grasp?
Because Jesus is nice and polite and doesn't ever talk that way.
Exactly, Cassie. And we also have, right? I mean, it's also a matter of, if you read the text, and a type of postcolonial view of this text is to see the woman teaches Jesus a lesson, right? That this Syrophoenician woman actually teaches Jesus this immense and important lesson about hearing her, and so she has some authority and this power. Why would that be disturbing to the powers that be?
Some feminist theologians clean up Jesus by saying, well, he was speaking to a woman, and how radical was that? So, yeah, I think that's a part of it is the sense of the breakdown of cultural norms, the sense of the ability of a woman to engage in theological dialogue with Jesus, the recognition of her humanity and shared humanity.
And she kind of shows him up, right? That's the other reason you gotta polish it up, is because the female is a little bit smarter in this situation, or however you want to phrase that, right?
And it challenges the colonialistic mindset, right? I mean, it challenges the powers that be. It upends the apple cart, right? And now I think, you know, the way I look at this text from the lens that I try to now is that the woman who had no power and no status actually taught Jesus this valuable lesson and actually helped Jesus go on to become who Christ was called to be, you know, who Jesus was going to be. And what a powerful statement, and what a statement that tells us that we have to see all of humanity and all of God's creation as it is. But that's a challenge for us, right? I mean, that's really a tough thing for us to grasp, because when we do that, then we have to start seeing each other as equals. And we have to start seeing each other as one body of Christ. Once again, we go back to the Ephesians text. We will all be one body, right? This is the challenge of the time. And the Syrophoenician woman is this great example. Like you said, Cassie, she shows him up in a lot of ways. And she plays the power role in this text. And that is so challenging, and that's one of those things that when we started, and what Dr. Crowder pointed out so well was that we've gotten this dynamic where this power is such an important piece of the puzzle. You know, I mean, our status and our need to be that within our churches, since we're starting to lose this status or lose this power. I mean, our churches here in town have gotten to that place where they're probably all diminishing as far as attendance wise in Burden. And it's almost like grasping to try and hold on to that time of the 50s when it was so perfect and, you know, church was done right. In fact, I had somebody come into my office one day and say, you've got to do church this way, like we did it in the 50s, because that's when we were good, when it was good, you know, because that's where we're at. I mean, and that status, and that one, the Syrophoenician woman challenged all of those status quos, all those moments. Go ahead,
John. So I preached on this in seminary as my, my big chapel thing. And the Bible professor of New Testament, he kind of took me to task on that, because I preached from the perspective that I felt like Jesus was being called out on what was an error. And he said, you know, Mark would not have presented Jesus like that. But I think one of the deals with when you're thinking of post-colonial theology, you're thinking of really elemental foundational ideas that Christianity has codified over 2,000 years. That for example, one of the signs of divinity would be absolute correctness. You know, that there would be no teachability isn't something that we have asserted is a part of the divine. And so when we question these things to ourselves and our congregants, often we are, what is sin? You know, if Jesus is without sin, why is he calling a woman a bitch, basically? You know, which is what we need to, but it causes us to grapple with some very basic things. Is it a sin to make a mistake, or is it just part of being human? And if Jesus is fully human and fully divine, does it mean that there is a correction that other people can provide me in my pastorate, where I am definitely fully human and 0% divine?
is it also because is it also this and that? See, I don't view it as her putting Jesus in check. Because I'm like, you out of your place if you think you can put the Lord of Lords. This ain't your husband. This is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. This is not feminism. This is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. This is the one that holds the keys to heaven and hell. This is the one that formed those babies in your womb. And so maybe I'm listening with a different background because I'm like, no, Jesus knew what Jesus was doing. Jesus, instead, he was leading by example. Because he allows through grace and mercy. He knows who he is, and he was setting, in my opinion, of exegesing the text, he was setting an example to the bloody rabbis. The bloody rabbis were the rabbis who would have not tolerated that, closed their eyes every time they saw a woman coming and rather hit their head against the wall and bleed and fall down than they even acknowledge that a woman exists, because you are property. We are property. And so in looking at I see Jesus as a liberator. Mm-hmm. And as a liberator, this is what he did his entire ministry. And so that's where the different dialogue with, I think Jackie, I can't think of her name right this minute, Jackie Grant has a book called A White Woman's Christ and a Black Woman's Jesus. And how we view Jesus in two different views. And so as I'm listening, I'm hearing you, I'm acknowledging what's being said, but at the same point in time, I don't exegese the text the same way. If that makes any,
sure.
I'll take replies to that.
Donna, it's great. That's exactly right. That's one of the challenges, right? Is that one of the beautiful pieces of the puzzle. And I think one of the steps that we have to get to is getting to where we live into the reality that our God is a God of abundance. And what I mean by that is that our God is not an either or God, but a both and God, and with both and, then we have the ability to look at this and to hear the voices as they work, and to work through them together, and to see the challenges that every one of the texts bring up, and it's so important to share with each other. That's why I love having these dialogues, because this is what we have to do in order to build relationship with each other. Because if we don't have a relationship with each other, then what are we doing? And why, then we're not going to do the next step. We're not going to do, the next steps that need to be done to bring forth the difference that needs to be made, right? And the church for far too long has not built relationships to make differences. The church for far too long has been self-preserving rather than opening the doors to being with each other and walking into God's kingdom here on this earth, So Donna, I think that's fantastic. What else comes to mind when you hear this text? I mean, firsthand.
Reverend Chin, I see some on your face.
I am. I'm totally confused by this, because if we recognize God is perfect, his son is perfect, mm-hmm. then who could have the upper hand on him? Mm-hmm. If we said that Jesus never fails, who could have the upper hand on him? And so when I listened to that, I cringed, and I was trying to hold his face together. And I guess the face didn't hold together, it fell apart. He was giving her opportunity to really see who he was. Because when she initially came into the story, she heard about a man who could do something. She didn't hear about it, she heard about a man. But when she got there, something changed in her. And she was a mother, and a mother will go all the way. Mm-hmm. And she had to humble herself some more. And when he saw something different in her, then he said, your baby already healed, go on home somewhere. I can't, and I'm not saying the other lady doesn't have a right to opinion. it's not mine. Because I see him as all them sayings we say in the church. He is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. He is my all I am. He is I am. And so he can't be tricked. He can't be put down in that manner that she got the upper hand on him. That would make her God.
I don't look at it, thanks, Crystal. I don't look at it as an upper hand so much as a flexibility with the Lord's agenda. The context is he was trying to lay low.
Right.
He was trying to
part.
get out from all of the pressures, and he wanted to be anonymous. She persisted, and I see it as a wonderful relationship that the Lord can see her need, and he can set aside what he wanted to do and minister, kind of like the miracle on the way to the miracle. You know, he's supposed to go see the daughter who's dying, and then up comes this woman, you know, she's gotta touch him, and you know, we gotta have a little lesson about all that, and then I still gotta, you know, make it to the next miracle. So I guess to me it is a living, breathing relationship that I find quite both intriguing and encouraging, that we can be in relationship with the Lord, and he can really listen to us and hear us and change and minister to us, even though that wasn't his first thought.
Matt, can I interject?
You know what?
Something.
We don't know what his first thought was.
Well, that's true.
Can I interject something real quick? Because I hear what everybody is saying. I hear the feminists. I hear the liberationalists. I hear I hear all of it. And what keeps going through my mind is something that Dr. King said many years ago. He said the most segregated time in America is at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, and 11 o'clock on, and that's what I'm hearing right now. I'm a Kingian, but I'm first and foremost a Christian, and the way we the reason I brought up Jackie's book is because our experiences are so different. The way people of color see Jesus is versus, I'll use the term versus the way maybe European Americans see Jesus, is Jesus had to bring us through the standpoint of enslavement, which is what we were talking about earlier. Jesus had to bring us to a point where we're put in chains, as we saw earlier, and where a culture, a history, a language was changed, and your name was even changed. And so the standpoint had to be, is this the same Jesus that I worship? Because this Jesus said, slave, be obedient to your master. And so it's a twofold fight, whereas European Americans went females sometimes, and you can speak back to me because I cannot speak for you. I can only speak as an interpretation, okay? It's sometimes because of the oppression, which is a different kind of oppression that feminists talks about from the European American man, is I have a right to vote, I have a right to speak, you have oppressed me to some degree. And so I see Jesus and I'm going, how can this Jesus call this woman as, well, he didn't call her, he related to the culture of the people, right? And so we're seeing two different Jesus. And so as I'm hearing Crystal and I are saying, no, this is Lord of Lords, King of Kings. And so I think that that's where the dialogue or the different perceptions are taking place is also based on cultural experiences, one of privilege and one of oppression, one and both wanting liberation. If that, and so it is a lot of hierarchical systems that are taking place, and that's why the dialogue is having, we're hearing two different things, we're viewing two different Jesus. Our starting places are at two different places of Jesus and Christ, even within this story. It's, and I think, yeah. That,
oh, sorry, Donna, go ahead. And but yeah, it's, and I think Crystal, you hit a really good point, right? As far as I like the piece of the puzzle is that when you talk about the Syrophoenician woman giving it everything she had, right? She had everything, and isn't that where we need to get to as church, giving it everything we have, to understand how we can be the good news that God calls us to be, right? Teresa of Avila says it really well, that we are called to be the hands and feet of Christ, and in order to do so, we have to be willing to be in dialogue with each other and be willing to walk with each other. In order to do so, we have to be in relationship with each other, which means pushing each other to see as we can as a whole, rather than in these splintered ways, you know, in a sense. That's the challenge. That is absolutely the challenge. I mean, we can sit and I know that I've had conversations with many people here from my church that have been raised in our community, have really never experienced anything outside of the Midwest farmland, right? I mean, so how do we educate? How do we teach each other to do that? Well, I think it starts with these kind of things. It starts with being in dialogue with each other. You know, it starts walking the walk and hearing each other's voices and understanding that we do come from different perspectives. We do see different things, right? You know, I always like to tell one of my stories of growth or learning was when I went in the Navy as an 18-year-old kid. You know, I was awakened to a whole new world. Right. I mean, I went from this small town and smaller than the one I live in right now, and went into the military, and I ended up on a ship with 300 men in Sasebo, Japan. Right. And so I'm in this new environment, and I played basketball on the ship's team. And I said, I use a term that my grandpa used on me oftentimes. And my best friend on the basketball team pulled me aside and said, wait a minute, this is not how you speak, right? That was an educational lesson for me, right? This is what we have to do as church too, is have these dialogues and have these discussions and work towards building with each other and work towards seeing each other as whole and seeing each other as human. You know, I think that's where we've gotten to. One of the things, especially after this week, I mean, working on this presentation changed Wednesday afternoon, right? I mean, as I'm sitting there watching this horror action take place, and I'm thinking about, oh my gosh, we have to learn to see each other as human within the church. You know, see each other as being who we're called to be, and that means opening our eyes again. It means hearing the different views and the different understandings. It means understanding that there are charismatic Christians and there are extremely low church Christians, high church Christians, however you want to put it, right? And so, but until we do that, then until we can be in dialogue with this, how do we take on the bigger topics? You know, that's the challenge. You know, that's the challenge for us. And I think we need to grow in that. And I loved how Dr. Tisby talked about how attention, you know, or being willing to be aware, being willing to commit, or being willing to be in a relationship, but then the commitment, you know, the commitment. I think it was Pastor Ed said, how do we make this change more than just sitting in a Zoom meeting from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock, right? How do we do this tomorrow, Sunday morning? How do we begin to change the church tomorrow morning? You know, how do we do that? These are the challenges that we face right now. These are the challenges that are ahead of us. And we've got to be able to do it with compassion and grace, because that's who we're called to be, you know. And so as we look at this, I love that you guys have been so open and willing to dialogue with this. This is what I was hoping to have, because this is the challenge. So as we go farther into this, the next step for us is, how do we commit? How do we commit to this? And what are some things that we can do in our local churches? You know, one of my favorite quotes is from Mother Teresa. You know, we can't all do great things, but we all can do little things with great love. And as I thought about this, I thought, wow, this is one of the things that we have to do. If we're going to make a difference, we have to do little things with great love. So I wanted to ask you guys, as we've gone through this whole day, we've gone through all the presentations, everything. What are some things that we can do as church to begin this narrative, this change? What are some things do you think we can do as individuals and as collective church to get to the next step?
Well, if you're going to commit, you're going to need to be intentional. And part of learning other people's viewpoints is spending time with them, which, you know, sucks in a pandemic. But the sense that we have to be intentional about doing Bible study together, something as simple as, you know, you can't just we're going to do our Bible study on Sunday morning, we're going to do ours on Sunday afternoon, and so yeah, anyway, to be intentional about studying together, and to build relationships that way.
Thank you, Heather.
For me, it's about Christian action. It's about getting out and doing something intentional, educating. I go around and I educate businesses and other community areas of what it's like to be homeless and what is it like to not have a place to lay your head or to stay warm. And I actually help out Ed Morris. I live up by Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and I help Ed by going to businesses and picking up carloads of donations and meeting him so that he can use them. But it's educating the schools. I have the schools here helping so that they understand, just because you're in your warm little bed at night, you have a nice place to sleep and food to eat, there's tent city that has nothing, and you need to understand what that means and how it impacts the community. And so for me, it's out educating big businesses. I mean, like F.E. Moran Corporation down in Northbrook, explaining, going in and talking to their 300 employees about what this means. What can you do to help these people? So it's spreading the wealth of knowledge out to people that can do something about it. But I don't want people to just throw money at something. I want them to understand what they're actually doing, that it's making an impact to help somebody's life, or to get them into a hotel for the night, or help them get their medication. I have another friend that is part of John Eckert's church down on the south side. Her name is Dr. Darlene Cothran. She's a minister, and I work with her and her friend Christy. They go and pick up all the medications from all the Walgreens and CVS's that they're about to expire. They bring them down in the city and they just distribute them to people that need cough syrup. So it's Christian action for me. It's not just talking about it. It's getting out there and doing something and making a change in somebody's life.
I think the white church has to own its sin and name that, right? We've not done a good job at that, and it was on full display this week. And if you're not saying so, I mean, let's think about the text for this week. So if you're doing Epiphany this week, King Herod and his raging, right? If you're doing baptism of the Lord Sunday, what baptism are you called to in this time? And naming evil for what it is. We like nice, polite Jesus, and we get comfortable with that. but we don't name and claim the Jesus who flips tables because of how the system is treating people economically, right? And so we as the church have to own that. And I mean, like I said, the two texts for this week, if you're preaching the lectionary, how can you not, as the church, say, this is what's been on display this week. How are we called to act in this manner?
Thanks, Cassie.
Yeah, first I want to say amen to Cassie. And then I want to say with what Sherry is saying, you know, in that Christian activism, it's more than just making ourselves feel good, though. You know, writing the check so that we can feel good. It is
Right.
about building relationships. It is about getting involved in the messiness of people's life. It is about knowing that if we're not being transformed by this, then there isn't probably a genuineness to it. And so it is about being willing to be uncomfortable as we go about the gospel work.
It is a reminder. There's a, I go back to this, I'm a Kingian, and because I truly believe that Dr. Martin Luther King, I've been a Kingian since I've been 5, and I'm a Christian, and I'm a Kingian, and I'll probably die a Kingian. But there was a two people who always stick out in Dr. King's movement. One was a little white, she called herself a little white housewife from Detroit. Her name was Viola LaRusso. And Viola LaRusso, that's what she was. She was a housewife. And she told her husband she had a call, she wanted to go down south to help. And he said, well, what you gonna do down there? She wasn't educated enough, she was just a mama. And she said, I can make sandwiches. And Viola LaRusso got up and went down to Mississippi, made sandwiches, drove folks so they could vote. And Viola LaRusso was driving two, I believe it's 2 African-American persons. And the car was pulled over and Viola LaRusso was murdered. I think it was Highway 57. But she gave her life. She was, like she said, I'm just a housewife. But she got up and she did and put her life on the line just like Martin Luther King Jr. did. And I always thank God for Viola LaRusso. I will never forget her name. White woman, housewife, who died for my rights. I wasn't even born yet. Then there was a white Unitarian minister named Reverend Jim Reed. Reverend Jim Reed came down and marched, and he was the first to be murdered before they were able to cross over that line that we're talking about, that the bridge, the Emmaus Bridge with John Lewis. But Reverend Jim Reed, that white Unitarian minister, was one of the first to be murdered. I never forget his name because he died for me that I might have the right to vote. I look in the 20th and the 21st century, I look and I say, you know, in many aspects, the one person that I have constantly seen walking and marching and talking has been Michael Pfleger, who constantly is speaking up and speaking out and all these issues, and active in the church, the vertical and the horizontal of the cross. And he don't look like me. And so there are things that we can do great and small. And to always remember the name. Sometimes we just look at the big names, but sometimes if we call out the Viola LaRussos and the James Reeds and the thousands of millions of people whose name may not go down in the history book. My name may never go down in the history book, but every time I have the opportunity to speak up and to speak out, Dr. King, you saying, I got it on my cup right now, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so whether it is on a job, in a church or whatever, it's that moment in time that somebody else can hear. I'm gonna be quiet because y'all about to make me cry. All right.
So can I say something?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not as grandiose as some of y'all, because I'm still learning. I'm 69 years old. I'm just been in the mid program a couple of years and retired. old white guy, trying to learn. And my wife and I got involved right after the pandemic started in a food drive about March of this year. We've been helping ever since. Every week we go help work in the food pop up, and then we bring food back and bring it to people in our community. And one day, probably 5 months ago now, my wife was helping and I was helping. I was direct traffic. She was working with the food. And somebody asked something about some tacos. Did anybody want extra tacos? And my wife said something to the effect of, yeah, I know a family from Honduras that could use that. We'll take it to them. That afternoon, there was a post on our food pop-up page that if you're going to be racist, you don't need to be helping with the food drive. That comment was directed at her, she found out very quickly. And one of the things we learned about that was, what is my name? You may be from Honduras, but you have a name. We found out very quickly her name was Gladys. The other person we take food to, his name is Vivian. Another one we take food to is Brooklyn. We didn't know that. We were just taking food to them. We never got to know them. You were talking about relationship a while ago. And one of the things we have learned is we're not just, I mean, the people that we work with every week, even the ones that come to us and that we give the food to, are the same people every week. We have to do more than just give them food. We have to get to know them. We have to get to know what their name is and get to know their story. And so one of the things we've been focusing about, and one of the things when we first started the food drive, I didn't think there'd be anybody in Monee, Illinois that even needed food. We're not a poor community. We have but I started watching and we saw people who were walking down to the food pantry by Village Hall and then walking back with a sack of food. And we realized that our neighbors were going hungry. I live a block and a half from my church, and between where I live and my church are 10 different families that need food. We found out over the last couple of months. And although we knew them and waved at them all the time, we didn't know what their names was. So I think one of the things to answer your question a long ways is, what can we do? The first thing is get to know your neighbors, get to know their names, and get to know their story. Don't just take and drop food off of the door or knock on the door and give them food and say, here you go. And we have really focused on that. Now, just to make it clear, we haven't asked any one of them to come to our church, not one of them, because that's not our goal. We've actually had a couple ask about coming to our church, and that's a different story. But I've realized that one of the first things I have to do is get to know who they are and get to know their name. Because as I do that, I'm drawn into them and we begin to establish relationships. And I see Brooklyn all the time as she waves at me riding her bike down the street now. 6 months ago, I didn't know who she was. Now I know who she is, and I know her mother and I know her father. So that's something I think we can do and something we need to do. And it's something I wouldn't have done years ago, because they weren't the same color as me. They weren't the same people as me. I didn't have time. I was busy. And I've learned that I have to take the time. And taking that extra time has made all the difference as well, because now I have a name that goes with that face. And that person means something to me. And hopefully I mean something to them. And my witness can be that much stronger because of that. And it helps us to build what we call a community. Thank you.
No, thank you for sharing that, David. That's one of those things. Dr.
Can I jump in?
Go ahead, Melissa.
I think we also have to get over our fear of imperfect action. We want to do something, but we're afraid we're going to do it wrong.
Yep.
And, we probably are. I do that numerous times in the day. And, when it comes to issues of reconciliation, I would rather try imperfectly 1,000 times than to never try at all, because I don't know the perfect step to take. And I think recognizing that nobody is just one thing. We are all multifaceted, complex human beings. and being gentle with each other, being kind to each other. You know, when I mess up, I would like somebody to pull me aside and help me understand how I could do better. I would react better having that happen than if somebody calls me out and calls me names and assumes the worst of me. And, you know, we have so much of that in our world, but I think being afraid of imperfect action seizes a lot of us.
Thank you, Melissa. That is exactly one of the parts that I wanted to talk about too, was fear. You know, and when you're dealing with issues that we're talking about, fear gets in our way oftentimes. I mean, fear of not doing it right, fear of not being able to do enough, fear of you know, being uncomfortable. You know, Cassie nailed it. You know, too often we let that fear drive us when we're uncomfortable. You know, we don't like talking about things that make us uncomfortable. But the problem is that our history has mandated that we've stayed in the comfortable spot way too long, because that comfortable spot has harmed millions of people. And it's time to change that. It's time to get out of that fear-driven base, you know, and it's time to trust God completely. You know, as I'm listening to y'all, thank you all for sharing, because that's what it is we all live in different contexts, different places. And so there's no, I remember when I first started working on this, thinking I had to find exactly the formula, ABC, to get us over the hump, right? And everything else. Well, what do you think the knucklehead from Verdon, Illinois is going to be able to figure that out? Come on, that's not it. But what it is that we can all work together to truly be God's kingdom. If we're not scared of each other, if we don't let the fear or the anxiety lead us and hold us back from building and connecting with each other the way we're called to connect. If we're willing to see and look into our history and recognize where we need to change, because God calls us to change. You know, God didn't call upon us on that last night to be served. He called on us to serve one another, to hear one another, to see one another, to walk with one another, to wash each other's feet. And that takes courage. It takes courage. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to add that the other part of fear is the fear of rejection.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to put ourselves out because they might not be accepted in the manner or the way that we had intended or had hoped for.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karan. I mean,
I'd like to speak into that as I'm listening to all of this and feeling very, feeling all the guilt and shame rising in me of knowing that there are actions that can be taken. I feel like on a day-to-day basis, I acted. My entire career is based around social justice or gospel justice. But there are limits, and it's limited by fear, much fear of rejection. And that the thing that has been on my mind for a while, as far as another and new and step for me, is to put up a Black Lives Matter sign. And that's been on my mind for a while. I have a son who lives in Rhode Island, and the last time I visited there a year or so ago, there are Black Lives Matter signs on every other house in the yard. They're everywhere. And it's an all-white neighborhood, but that it's just acceptable to have it out there. And then I have a daughter who lives in Seattle, and when I visit her, again, I see Black Lives Matter signs all over. Now, my little neighborhood has been historically Republican, and I have even been afraid to speak up outside of that. And it's only been in the last 4 years or so that there's been a Democratic organization that has arisen, and I've stepped up as a precinct committeeman for that, and I feel it was scary to even step into that space to say and put up signs, not knowing what my neighbors will think. But I've been very glad that I've done that. And I've seen a growth in my community, and that we've actually booted out Republicans and have put in Democrats. But the step of putting up a Black Lives Matter sign is a tough one for me. And about 2 weeks ago, when I was driving through my town, I saw somebody had put up a Black Lives Matter sign, and their windows are still intact. There's no teepee on their trees. You know, I haven't, I'm on the police commission, so I haven't heard anything about anybody being harassed over that kind of stuff. But I confess, and maybe it comes from my childhood where I saw the cat that had no tail. And it's very deep seated. But I'm sharing it because I think that we all, no matter our background, have certain fears about stepping out too far away from what's acceptable in our community. And that keeps us all in slavery, theological, mental. I mean, it's not what Jesus wants of us. So I will continue to pray on this. One day I might have a sign in front of on my porch.
Judy, thank you for sharing that, because as you were speaking, I was thinking about my daddy. I just lost my daddy in March 2020. And my daddy, he was fourth down from the President of the United States. He was the first one of the first 100 African Americans to receive his CPA in North America, and made it U.S. Department of Treasury, place that most folks don't like, the IRS. Anyway, I say all that to say my daddy was a hardworking person and accomplished a great deal. And I've been a Kingian, and my daddy one day when I was going to Atlanta, make a long story short, to go to study at the Martin Luther King Center, my daddy tried to talk me out of it. And I'm a daddy's child. He never tried to talk me out of anything in my life. And my daddy, who to me was the strongest man in the whole wide world, I don't care about nobody else's daddy, this is my daddy. And very logical. My daddy said to me, they gonna kill you like they killed Martin. I'm scared for my child. And I told him, and I saw this very strong, very analytical, left brain man who ran 1/4 of the nation for the U.S. Department of Treasury, in tears almost in his kitchen, because I said, Daddy, I'm going down to Atlanta and I'm going to study the teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I said, because Daddy, two things. One, Jesus said, if any man is to follow me, he must pick up his cross and follow me. The second thing is the first thing I learned as a Kingian, this is my walk, not yours, Judy. First thing I learned when I was 5 years old from Dr. Martin Luther King, he said that we must overcome fear. No man is free if he fears death. For at the moment you conquer the fear of death, at that moment, you are free. And so death doesn't necessarily mean the death of a bullet. It can mean the death of your reputation. It could mean your neighbors not talking to you anymore because you put up a Black Lives Matter sign. It could be because you bought the man in your house and they cut off the cat's tail. It is fear is real. I am fearful I can't tell you how many times I done been wrote up for speaking out against injustice. I can't tell you how many times people have told me that even people that look like me have said, be quiet, you speaking up too much. It is a debt that is old. And so together, just like Viola LaRusso, Jim Reed, together, the beauty of to me, the beauty of Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement was the standpoint that together we overcome. The same people that put fear in you are the same people that put fear in me. And so I can never tell anybody lay down your life because of whatever. That is something that each person has to look at, and sometimes have to take each walk that they have to take. So fear is there for all of us. So you're not the only one that's fearful. It is just, and as you were talking, I was thinking about my daddy. I'm still here. He gone on to glory, but at the same point in time, I told my daddy I owe a debt, and I'm gonna pay my debt. I owe my debt to every Quaker that worked in the Underground Railroad. I owe my debt to every Viola LaRusso, James, and thank you for putting their names up there. I appreciate that. I owe my debt. So it's paying back a debt. And I said, and I owe my debt to Jesus the Christ. How do you see Jesus? I see Jesus as one who was a liberator, who got punished by the government, okay, and was hung on an old rugged cross at Calvary, a man that taught women Torah and gave more respect to women than their own husbands gave them sometimes. And so it just becomes a personal theology, the vertical and the horizontal. And what are we, for me, I can't speak for nobody else. I can only speak for me, because that's what I'm going to be judged by me. I'm not going to be judged by nobody else. And so the first step is to look at the fear and to look at the reality of what will crazy folks do if they don't like your theology. So it is real. Death is real. Ostracism is real. Poison pen letters are real. Cattails being cut off are real. So it's a real fear. So I want to say thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Donna. And our time's about up, so I want to close us with a call that I've been reading all week this week, mainly because I'm preparing for my sermon tomorrow, Cassie. So, so it's 1 Joshua, and it's a call for each of us and all of us. This comes from verse 6 through 9. Long ago, I promised the ancestors of Israel that I would give this land to their descendants. So be strong and be brave. Be careful to do everything my servant Moses taught you. Never stop reading the book of the law he gave you. Day and night, you must think about what it says. If you obey it completely, you and Israel will be able to take this land. I've commanded you to be strong and brave. Don't ever be afraid or discouraged. I am the Lord your God, and I will be there and help you wherever you go. We are called to be strong and brave, and that's the attitude we have to have as we go forward. To do this work, we have to be strong and brave. We have to be willing to trust God completely to walk us through it. And finally, I want to close with these words from Oscar Romero. He writes, "Only when we see the God of our Lord Jesus Christ illuminating our dawns, our seas, and our volcanoes will we understand that God has created a world out of love to give to God's children, with whom God wants to enter into communion of family. In this way, we understand how the earth groans beneath the weight of sin, because humanity has not understood that the whole of creation exists for the happiness of all creation, and not just for us to be comfortably settled here on this earth. God's creation and God's love is for us all. And so as we go forward to do this work, be strong and brave and be open to trusting God completely. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, John. That was a wonderful presentation. I also want to say that I think that we're all wiser because of your willingness to share in a rich discussion. I thank you for your openness. I thank you for the trust that was exhibited here among each of us. I thank you for your willingness to see beneath the surface and maybe spy out another way. I thank you for your vulnerability for the sake of understanding the task that lies ahead of us. And John, I really applaud you for your thought-provoking, eye-opening, and very challenging presentation. You provided us with a new lens through which to screen the issues. I think we've all been enriched because of our attendance here today. John is going to end our workshop by presiding over administration of Holy Communion. I'm not sure how many of us have our elements or sacraments in front of us, but I'd like to take a 5-minute break so that we can gather those things. John, how do you want us to proceed?
When we get back, what we'll do is if you have your elements with you, I will do a short communion prayer, and then we'll do the words of institution, and we will partake in the elements together as one body.
Thank you. And at the end of that, John, if you would give us a benediction, that would be wonderful. And after the benediction, we're all free to go and ponder all of the rich insights that we've gained today. So let's take a 5-minute break and go gather our elements.
As we come to the table today, let us come with open hearts and open minds. Let us come willing to see the Almighty as the Almighty, with a trust level to know that in these elements, we are given the sustenance and the nutrients to go forth and be the transformation that God calls us to be. Let us come to the table with open hearts and open minds to hear and to feel God's presence in the breaking of bread and sharing of the cup. Let us come willing to share our table with all the way God intends for us to share it, willing to see the marginalized and be able to walk with the marginalized as we break bread together. Let us be willing and strong enough to allow these elements to empower us and to challenge us and to guide us as we go about our days. Allow them to teach us to truly walk the path that you place us on, Lord. As we come to this table, let us remember that precious evening when you looked lovingly at your disciples and you asked them to remember. Let us remember. Let us remember, and let us never forget. Let us never forget our call to servanthood. Let us never forget our call to be one with the entire body of Christ. Let us never forget our responsibility to stand for justice and reconciliation. Let us never forget all that you have taught us, Lord, through your life and your teachings. On the night before he died, Jesus looked over the room and he saw his friends, the disciples, and he asked them as he lifted the bread and broke it to take and to eat, because it was his body broken for each and every one of them. And he said, every time you do this, do so in remembrance of me. In the same manner, after supper had ended, he looked over at his disciples and he said, this cup is a cup of a new covenant. It's poured out for the forgiveness of all sins. I tell you, I shall not drink of it again until I drink of it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. And he asked each of them to take and to drink and to do so in remembrance of him. Most glorious God, we thank you. We thank you for giving us a chance to come together as community, as the body of Christ, as one. We ask that you would empower us and bless us as we go forward to truly be strong and courageous enough to live your will in all that we do. Let us be the hands and feet that you call us to be as we go forth into our worlds. Let us be amazed and awed by your presence in our life, and let us share that amazement and share that awe and wonder in all that we do this day and every day. And as always, let us go in peace and in service to your glorious good news. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.